Okay, so continuing with the whiteboard lectures for today, what we also need to do at this point is we do need to go ahead and build the aggregate demand side of the aggregate demand, aggregate supply framework. Now, it's important to understand that when we cast this sort of idea in the context of the sort of classical, neoclassical versus sort of Keynesian idea, that first and foremost, the sort of just from a basic, Keynesian idea, aggregate demand is important. The classicals, basically just didn't really think much about aggregate demand. There was some sort of movement when you apply the neoclassical sort of consumption ideas, so you can sort of say a little bit about aggregate demand. But in a world where supply creates demand, there's just not going to be much importance ultimately that you placed on the aggregate demand side. In the Keynesian world, however, aggregate demand is seen as, in a sense, almost more important than supply. And it's important to remember why that is. It's the Great Depression, and it's not just that there was this big recession, but it was also what governments did in response to the Great Depression and sort of the subsequent extension of the economic misery. So people like Keynes were deeply affected by what they saw as just the sort of economic puzzle of the Great Depression, what actually causes the Great Depression to happen in the first place, to what causes the initial recession. But then also, okay, what does that mean for the economy moving forward? And then, okay, what does that mean for the arguments that we've been making about policy from the perspective of this sort of classical and neoclassical ideas? And so ultimately, what Keynes sees is completely unresponsive fiscal and monetary policy, right? Let's just put the United States as the example, because the United States is the core of the Great Depression. The Great Depression becomes a global economic recession, but it is the worst in the U.S. and in many ways it originates in the U.S. And so the response to the Great Depression is basically the federal government does nothing on the fiscal policy side until around 1930. There is a precipitous drop in government revenues because the economy is starting to tank and consumption is lower, investments lower, so tax collections are much lower. And so what the government does is they're very worried about not running a balanced budget. And so in order to try to keep the budget balanced, they actually increase taxes. They primarily did this through the imposition of tariffs, the famous and so-called Smoot-Hawley tariff. And these were, tax increases ultimately, and the point of them was to generate revenue to plug the budget hole that was created by the economic dysfunction that was really starting to take hold in the United States. And then, the economy did not improve after the tariffs were imposed. In fact, it seemed to get worse. On the monetary policy side, the central bank in the U.S., the Federal Reserve, which had been around, by 1930 for about 17 years, was still, I would imagine, still figuring out what they sort of wanted to do in terms of responding to this particular policy need. That they don't really do much of anything on the central bank side. The central bank was very passive for a very long time. The central bank does not become more activist in the sense until the kind of late 60s, early 70s. And then, unfortunately, that was a lot of bad policy. And then, of course, the central bank becomes very activist at the beginning of the 1980s. And we'll talk a lot more about that when we get there. So there just wasn't much going on. And things just kept getting worse, right? We have a 4-year increase in unemployment. We have a 4-year economic contraction. The Great Recession, sort of as a comparison, was only a little over a year of a contraction, although from a value perspective, it was humongous. But the Great Depression was not only a lesson in we don't always know what's coming next in macroeconomic situations. We don't always sort of understand the danger of something like a speculative bubble, because in ways the nature of a bubble is by the time you know you're in a bubble, it's too late. It's about to pop. And there have been a couple instances of these bubbles popping, and in all these instances, there's always a few people that stick their head out and say, "Oh, I saw this coming," and aren't I the most enlightened person? And but at the end of the day, the question is institutionally, sort of macroeconomy wide, what do people see coming? And sometimes you don't see these large shocks to the macroeconomy. Now, going back to this Keynesian idea of aggregate demand, the big thing that Keynes sort of also started to really argue for was that aggregate demand itself was erratic, that it fluctuated a lot. This is an era where macroeconomics starts to become very interested in sort of, is it the role of government to stabilize this erratic aggregate demand situation? Is it the federal government's role to, in a way, maybe smooth over the erratic nature of aggregate demand? And then sort of the calculus of this is the benefits of doing that worth the cost, right? Because the cost of so-called demand management, that's what we ended up referring it to, demand management. The cost of demand management is, of course, just sort of from the perspective of markets. Let me make this. I apologize here. So from the perspective of markets, government intervention is something that we should sort of care a lot about. I think even modern contemporary, like fairly liberal economists. I'm just trying to move this whiteboard over. I cannot seem to do that for some reason. Yeah, there we go. Sorry. And so the idea is that, well, okay, if the government's going to intervene, we don't want it to be the case that the government sort of starts making, a lot of economic decisions. When we talk about intervention, when we talk about demand management, even amongst Keynesians who support the idea of more demand management policy as a means of stabilization. So you'll start to hear the term stabilization a lot, stabilization policy. Now, ultimately, there's a lot of different opinions on what like actual stabilization policy looks like. What does that actually mean? Because if you have, very different opinions about what should be done, you're also going to have very different opinions about what stabilization actually means. But for the most part, we can think about stabilization in the context of the Fed. I like to sort of impose the Fed's dual mandate, where the Fed's dual mandate is we want low and stable inflation. So low and stable inflation. And of course, we want low unemployment. Now, we're going to go a little step further here, and we're going to think not just in terms of low unemployment, but we're actually going to think in terms of full employment. We want the economy to be fully employed. And if the economy is not fully employed, we want to think about policies that are going to get it back to full employment. These things are what we think about in terms of stabilization policy. So when the economy is doing well, then policy should be focused on, in a sense, keeping it going well. And usually when the economy is going well, from a stabilization perspective, this means that the government sort of backs off, the sort of central bank backs off to some extent. And from the central bank's perspective, it becomes much more important for them to focus on inflation targeting. That sort of is one of the big lessons of sort of the whole kind of 100 years of fiscal and monetary policy of the 20th century, is that the sort of central bank is really good, or in a way better, at focusing on inflation Um, and then sort of the idea would be that on the fiscal policy side, they should focus a little bit more on unemployment. They should focus a little bit more on jobs. That was sort of the kind of Keynesian idea that to some extent gets sort of warped and manipulated in terms of what people, when they say, okay, this is a Keynesian idea, again, people have taken Keynesian ideas of stabilization policy preferences and then said, okay, this sort of justifies all sorts of other government intervention. And, you have to be careful with that because, one lesson we have of the 1960s is that there was far too much sort of expansionary fiscal policy and far too little contractionary monetary policy. And so what you have in the late sort of last few years of the 1960s is a lot of inflation, a lot of government spending. Taxes had been cut earlier in the decade, so you're starting to run government deficits. Nixon's, really, really worried about winning the election in '72, and so he's just, doing all sorts of weird things. There's price and wage controls, which we had never done before and have never done since. So there's a lot of really bad policy, especially towards the tail end of the 1960s. And there are folks who I think are quick to blame Keynesian stabilization policies for that particular era because there had been so much Keynesian stabilization policy in the 50s and 60s, sort of post World War II, that then the bad policy that came about in the 1960s was also sort of blamed on sort of the Keynesian consensus. When in reality, I don't think Keynes would have ever argued that the U.S. government should, have the war on poverty. I think Keynes would have agreed with that. I don't think Keynes would have necessarily agreed with the Vietnam War and the continued increase of American involvement in the Vietnam War, which definitely put upward pressure on the economy, definitely contributed to policy. And then I also don't think that Keynes would have supported the bad monetary policy at the time. So it's not so much, I think, in the historical hindsight, Keynesian policy that sort of caused those problems, but it was a bad policy just sort of writ large. And I think that's part of the lesson of macroeconomics is that it isn't sort of one particular ideology or one particular way of thinking that tends to cause problems. It usually ends up just being kind of bad policy. And there's bad policy in no matter what framework you happen to use. We may ultimately think, as mainstream economists do, that the sort of Keynesian neoclassical sort of mishmash ends up being probably the best way to think about macroeconomics. But it's not perfect, right? It's the least worst in many ways, is the way that I often like to describe it. It's important for us to sort of keep that in mind. So now, with that in mind, with that increase in the relative importance of aggregate demand, let's actually build aggregate demand now from our ISLM analysis. So the simplest way to think about aggregate demand here is let's start with a money market here. And then let's manipulate that money market in such a way that we're looking at differences in real money balances. So remember, in the money market, we have these sort of money supply, real money balance vertical lines, stock of real money balances. And the idea here is that we're just going to manipulate prices. So we get two different movements of money stock. So P prime, this is prices going down. This increases the money stock, puts downward pressure on interest rates. P double prime is prices increasing. This shifts the money balance to the left. This puts upward pressure on interest rates. And then when we carry this over to the LM ISLM analysis, whenever we have these changes in price level that cause these shifts of real money balances, cause shifts in the money stock, this is also going to cause shifts in the LM curve. And so when prices go up, the LM curve is going to shift back and to the left, and when prices go down, the LM curve is going to shift out and to the right. And so what that means is that we get lower outputs with higher prices, and higher output with lower prices. It actually, if you go back to the video I made in which we put together aggregate demand in a classical model, it ends up not being that much different. Actually, it's surprisingly similar. And so then ultimately we just add here aggregate demand, and so we have our three output realizations here: y prime, y, and then y double prime. And then, of course, y double prime is associated with p double prime, y is associated with p, and then y prime is, as we have seen, associated with p prime, right? And then we just connect it, and there you have aggregate demand, right? So we actually, in the Keynesian sense, aggregate demand comes from equilibrium in the money market and goods market, and that's where we get this ISLM analysis, which now feeds into aggregate demand. What this is going to enable us to do is to not only capture things like fiscal monetary policy changes in the ISLM analysis, and therefore capturing what it does to interest rates, but also being able to carry that over and show what fiscal and monetary policy or shocks are going to do in terms of aggregate demand, which ultimately we're going to have a very similar sort of shift kind of idea, right? And so we'll get to a little bit more of that a little bit later. But it's important for us just to kind of, again, set up the idea of aggregate demand in the context of ISLM. And then real quick, just sort of one last thing that I want to do here. Move this out of the way here. Try to at least. Actually, let's just do this. Let me just do a new whiteboard. Sorry for the delay here. Okay. So last thing we want to do here is now just we've got the aggregate demand curve. Let's think about, let's do some policy experiments in the context of the aggregate demand curve. So the context here is going to be that let's put aggregate demand, aggregate supply here. So aggregate demand. Let's just for now have a normal upward sloping aggregate supply. We'll talk about that in the next video. But for now, let's just have a normal upward sloping aggregate supply curve. And then down here, we're going to put our ISLM analysis. So we'll keep the same equilibrium here. So ISLM, so particular level of output and a particular interest rate. So there's output. We'll call it 0, 0, 0, and we also get price is 0. So the thing here is by the way that we're illustrating this particular graphical representation is that the economy is currently at sort of full employment. The way we know that the economy is at full employment is because full employment is going to be defined by this equilibrium between supply and demand. So we have full employment here, and so this means that at y0 we have full employment. Right? That's the basic idea. Right? Now, what we're going to show later on is that we will always have equilibrium here. There will always be equilibrium in the ISLM. That does not mean necessarily that we will have equilibrium in terms of aggregate supply, aggregate demand, which means that you can have equilibrium in terms of money markets and goods markets. That does not mean that you'll be at full employment. This is an important part of the sort of kind of Keynesian argument right now. For now, let's just not worry about that, and let's just assume that we're currently at full employment. So the idea here would be, let's say the government decides to increase government spending. So let's say that G goes up, right? So government spending goes up. Well, we know that government spending going up is going to trigger a shift of the IS curve. So IS0 to IS1 in this direction. In the short run, and we'll talk a little bit more about short run and long run in a bit. This is going to put upward pressure on output and upward pressure on real interest rates. Now, what does that mean in terms of aggregate demand? Well, it's important to keep in mind that this aggregate demand was set, or is a schedule of prices and output set at the initial interest rate. So at R0, we get aggregate demand 0. But now there is this increase in the IS upwards, which corresponds to a higher output level than we had previously. Okay, so that means that we go up, and prices haven't necessarily changed immediately. So the way we get this is also causing a shift in the aggregate demand. Okay, so you get this new higher level of output in aggregate supply, aggregate demand, as we do in the ISLM. Now, what ends up sort of happening here is that you get this initial boost in output, but then you're going to get some of that is going to get eaten up by inflation. And so that ultimately the full change in GDP, we'll call this final, Y final. So Y final is where GDP ends up. Okay, and you'll notice that Y final is between Y0 and Y1. Here, let me make this a little bigger. Sorry, there we go. All right, so now the question is, okay, how do we make sense of that in terms of ISLM? So how do we make sense of the fact that some of this inflation has eaten some of our output? Well, how are we going to show inflation in ISLM? All right, inflation reduces real money balances. This reduction in real money balances causes the LM curve to shift now back into the left. And so what you get is you get at this final level of output, you get an LM curve shift slightly back in this direction. So LM2. So this increase in government spending leads to an increase in the IS curve. This increase in the IS curve, this increase in the IS curve leads to an increase in aggregate demand, right? This aggregate demand causes prices to go up. The increase in prices causes the LM curve to shift down. And so that is ultimately how we get from Y0 to YF. So the sort of path of output is we start at Y0, the economy improves to Y1, then inflation eats up some of output and you get Y final. So the final resting point is we have output, which is higher, we have prices, which are higher, and we have interest rates, which are higher. Okay, now let us okay. Instead, let's start the economy below full employment. Let's say that full employment would be here. So we'll call this Y bar. Okay, Y bar to represent full employment. And then we will think in terms of real interest rates. So Y bar. Okay, now the problem, however, is that equilibrium in the goods and money markets, for whatever reason, currently has us at a level of output we'll call Y0 below full employment, below what we might call potential. So we have real interest rate here. Now we take this up and we're going to make an assumption that the lack of equilibrium is transmitted through aggregate demand, such that the actual kind of aggregate demand that we have is lower. Let's say right here. Well, no, let's just take this up, and then we'll say aggregate demand is currently here. Okay. So the argument is that aggregate demand is currently below where it would be if the economy were instead at full employment. So the Keynesian argument is that the reason why we're not at full employment is that aggregate demand is in fact dysfunctional, right? This is the argument for what happened during the Great Depression, was that the speculative bubble popping caused aggregate demand to shift, and such that there was now equilibrium in the goods and money markets that put the economy below full employment. Now, if you buy that story, that's what was going on during that particular time period, then this gives you, in a sense, justification or reason to try to boost aggregate demand back towards where it was previously, or back towards where we might sort of consider there to be potential. The other nice thing about this is that if we change kind of the way that we draw this, so let me just, it's gonna be exactly the same. Let me just change the way I draw it just a little bit. You'll see why I'm going to do that in just a second. So let's just put our output here. This is out, so this is aggregate supply. And so now what we're going to think is we're going to think in terms of aggregate demand being here. Okay, so that's just where aggregate demand is. So currently, aggregate demand puts us at a place which is below full employment. That's sort of the argument. The other argument is that currently, if we think in terms of prices, and we think in terms of the idea that the economy, in a sense, is wanting to operate at full employment, right? It wants to be here. It wants, in a sense, this level of output and this price level. That when you push the economy, you push aggregate demand up by virtue of, say, government spending increasing, taxes decreasing, or you can increase the money supply, right? All of those things are going to cause aggregate demand to shift up, right? All of those things are going to cause aggregate demand to shift up. And the argument is that if we don't think there's going to be equilibration here, if economy is slow or never to return to Y bar, then boosting aggregate demand may be only way. What Keynes saw during the Great Depression was that the economy tanked and then stayed there. It did not self-correct, right? It did not self-correct. Now, why is this sort of important? It's important because that's what classicals believed. Classicals believed that the economy, if it ever is in disequilibrium, it will only be in disequilibrium for a very short period of time. It will always come back to full employment. That was the argument. Now, the simplest way to think about that classical argument is to have a vertical aggregate supply curve, because that's essentially what the classicals end up believing. So if you're a classical economist, you believe in a vertical aggregate supply curve, aggregate demand. So even if you buy the idea that aggregate demand can be shifted through government policy, which not all classicals believe that, but if you buy that idea, sort of neoclassical believe this, then boosting government spending by virtue of aggregate demand boosting causes no change in output and only causes inflationary pressure, right? Now, that's, of course, when the economy was at full employment. Now, remember, classicals believe that was pretty much always to be the case. Let's entertain the idea where maybe the economy is able to be not at full employment, at least momentarily. So what does that look like? So what that looks like is this. So the idea here is that the economy wants to be at full employment at Y bar, but for some reason the economy is currently at Y0. Currently at Y0, and that produces a price of P0. So what the classicals argued is that you shouldn't do anything. And the reason why you shouldn't do anything is because eventually we're going to just move to full employment. And better than that, we're going to move to full employment at lower prices, right? It's a very, very nice story. The Great Depression poked a huge hole in the story because what you did not see in the immediate aftermath of the Great Depression or 3-4 years afterwards is you did not see any semblance of returning to full employment, right? We had greater than 10% unemployment basically up until World War II. Which, by the way, the fact that World War II increased employment was, interestingly enough, a fairly strong sort of idea in support of this sort of Keynesian sense. So the classicals said, don't do anything to the economy. It's just going to equilibrate on its own. And if you do try to boost the economy, all you're going to do is cause inflation. That's the kind of classical argument. The more Keynesian argument is, of course, that is very costly, that allowing the economy to just re-equilibrate on its own may take a very long time. In the meantime, people are going to experience economic misery. The other, of course, problem is that what if it does not get back to full employment? What if, in fact, this economic dysfunction causes strains on the economic system that prevents it from getting to full employment on its own? Keynes did not think that economies got back to full employment on their own. It's just not something he believed. And the Great Depression to him was perhaps the best evidence of it. The other thing you have to remember is that Keynes does not necessarily buy the idea that markets are completely made up of completely rational economic agents, right? This idea of animal spirits that Keynes is famous for talking about. So these sort of swings in aggregate demand are not always going to necessarily be in the sort of rational sense. And so what that means, I think, to Keynes is that these fluctuations might be huge, that there might be big upswings and big downswings in terms of aggregate demand. And so what you needed was a fiscal policy and monetary policy strategy that worked, again, to sort of do the classic kind of sustainability thing, which is over time, you want to kind of smooth GDP over the time series. This is kind of the basic idea.